I'm Frederick Gerten, and I'm the filmmaker.
And I'm Leilani Farha, and I'm the advocate.
And this is Pushback Talks. Again, Leilani, so what is it cooking? Is it good news or is it bad news? I have some good news. And you?
Oh, it's tough times, Frederick. Tough times over here. My energy and heart are eaten up with what's happening in Palestine and in Gaza in particular. I have no words, actually. My heart is in a million pieces.
Outside in the square where I live, there is a demonstration every day in solidarity with the people in Gaza and Palestine. But it's interestingly enough, there's also youth out there defending the same stories, because in this town it's a very big Arab immigration, and there's been a lot of conflict, but they're now actually trying to build networks of communication between different communities. And it's happening. It's not easy, but it's happening. So, and I think that's the good news, that there's actually a lot of good people on both sides. And right now it seems like the bad guys are love to send bombs on each other. And then the bombs also drops on ordinary people. Yeah. But
I do think there are good news stories. I mean, I think the conversation is entirely different than it was in 2014 when there was the war in Gaza. I think people are actually using words like apartheid, which has never been used publicly with acceptance, and certainly not by, for example, congresswomen in the United States. So I do see that, but the suffering is what gets me, and of course it's so completely related to housing, so it touches me on every level.
Yeah, but this is not a podcast about what's going on in Jerusalem or in Gaza.
Nope.
Or in Tel Aviv or on the West Bank. So it's actually, we're going to talk about different things, but I was also going to give you some good news.
Yeah, please give us some good news.
Last week we were in Croatia, and they had elections in Croatia for city level elections, and in Zagreb the progressive mayor won, the green progressive mayor. So it's and he works closely with Iva Marketic, who was the guest in our last week's show. So they are really happy, and the mayor candidate of Pula, where I showed a film, who bought tickets to all her followers, she also got elected. So it's cool things happening.
That is very cool.
And then our friends in Chile are over the top happy, because there was an election to this new assembly to put up a new constitution in Chile, which people have been fighting for a long time. And the votes were in majority for progressive people. So the right wing didn't get enough votes to be able to block a new constitution, which is also a victory for these people who has been fighting on the streets for a year. So
Stunning.
Viva amazing. Chile.
Viva
and
Chile.
Viva Palestina también. It's also good news, also happy days for the billionaires.
Sure is. The pandemic has been good for them.
It's been good for them, and they're actually building bigger boats than ever. And our dear friend Jeff Bezos, he is building a yacht that is 127 meters long, means 470 feet long. It's only cost him $500 million, and it cost he actually need to also have other smaller boats following him with a helipad on. So, it's important stuff. And what I understand, the pandemic has been so difficult for the rich, because they can't go to the big parties anymore. So they actually have to build more yachts so they can get away from the legislations and the masks and the stuff. So there is actually, the shipyards building yachts are extremely happy now. And we should be happy for them too, shouldn't we?
So happy. Mm-hmm. Indeed. Yes. I did read that article in the Financial Times over the weekend about billionaires by Ruchir Sharma with Morgan Stanley. He says that the total wealth of billionaires in the last 12 months went from $5 trillion to $13 trillion. More than doubled in 12 months during a pandemic.
If I tell you that pisses me off, is that a bad word?
No, that's appropriate, I think. And let me tell you this, Frederick, sitting in Malmö, Sweden, in the past 5 years, the number of billionaires in Sweden went from 26 to 41, with 10 of those in the last year during the pandemic.
The share of the billionaires' wealth in the GDP of every country was extremely high. So in Sweden it was up to 30%.
It's crazy.
Which is a number I haven't seen. So it's actually, this is something, folks, we need to talk about. I saw somewhere now, it was a guy in California tweeting, one of the former Clinton administration people, Robert Reich.
Oh, yeah.
He said that the billionaires during the pandemic, the net worth went up 44% during the pandemic. So we are going from the happy days for the billionaires down to the streets of Los Angeles. I worked a lot in Los Angeles when I did the Bananas films. The law office was really close to Skid Row, the Skid Row area where the homeless are very much gathered in LA. And with us today, we have Pete White, founder and executive director of the Los Angeles Community Action Network, LACAN. And he's in the heart of Skid Row. Welcome to Pushback Talks, Pete.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Leilani, you've been there and you met with Pete, and you have always been talking so highly about him. Tell me, why is Pete such an important figure in the game here?
I met Pete a few years ago when I was UN Special Rapporteur. I decided to do a trip to California to look at homeless encampments. I was doing a report on informal settlements and encampments and human rights obligations of all levels of government. And when I put out the word that I wanted to go to California, the number of emails I received and texts, etc., saying, you have to meet Pete White at LA Can, who works in Skid Row, was crazy. So I had to meet Pete White, and I did. He was an incredible host, and he's an incredible advocate and organizer. Quite unusual, in my opinion, because he brings heavy intellect to it. He brings grassroots mobilizing and radicalism, and he brings arts and culture, and even gardens. Maybe Pete will talk about that. Community gardens to his work. But really, he's a phenomenal advocate, and I'm so happy, Pete, that you've joined us on Pushback Talks.
Thanks for having me again.
So, and I can tell you listeners out there that Pete has a T-shirt with the name Resist on. So, Pete, what you're resisting on Skid Row. Tell us more about your daily work.
Skid Row is situated in downtown Los Angeles. It's a 50 square block area that was designated as such based on a policy called the policy of containment, right? And so the state creates this boundaried area in an attempt to keep its poverty hidden in the eastern portion of downtown Los Angeles. And now, on the western portion of downtown Los Angeles, we have a campaign that we've been running for years called the Dirty Divide. On the west side, you find the multinational corporations, you find green space, you find parks, you find restrooms, right? You find infrastructure. But on the east side, where Skid Row exists, you find dark faces, right? Black and brown people, largely immigrants, women, right? And you find some of probably, on the one hand, the harshest conditions ever. There's nearly 4,000 folks living in this 50 square block area on the sidewalks. But then on the other side of that harsh reality, you find a resilient community, a very cultural community, a very loving community that's really fighting and organizing to get its fair share, right? Los Angeles, particularly in the downtown area, is a tale of two cities, because as the dance of the cranes, much like across the globe, the downtown centers are being gentrified, right? And so on the one hand, you have all of these cranes, even through the pandemic, right? You can't stop building. You have all of these cranes that are creating oftentimes homes that people will not live in, But then as the cranes rise, so do the informal settlements. And that's sort of my characterization of welcome to Los Angeles, welcome to Skid Row.
Pete, do you see a relation between the cranes and more people living in the streets?
Oh, absolutely. We see it, but a lot of people, even some who lived inside, through Airbnb or some other temporary situation, they don't understand the relationship, right? Because just on the government side, when we see these big catalyst projects, these multi-story towers, what people don't understand is the footprint around those multi-stories of luxury housing is oftentimes aided and abetted with public subsidy, right? Public giveaways, right? Either on land, tax forgiveness, and all of these types of things. The weird thing that people also don't get is that a lot of this brand new luxury developments, both for rent and for sale, sit empty. And this was a situation that was happening pre-pandemic. And, for us as organizers on the ground, back in the day, 10, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, we thought, right? Because you have to realize the idea of financialization of housing is just really catching on in the United States. Like folks in the UK and Canada, Leilani's work has been important to help us here in Los Angeles understand financialization. And so when we thought about organizing in these buildings, we would say, well, if we can just push hard enough, right, to make sure that there are provisions to bring us in these properties, if that doesn't happen, that property should tank, right? Because we're thinking in our minds, the property has to be full to work because everyone always tells you it doesn't pencil out, right? We need all the rents to pencil out. But then with financialization, we finally realize they don't have to be full, right? People are parking their cash here, right? This is a cash cow situation. And so finally, that has been grounded in Los Angeles over the last 5-10 years. Like we're really getting it now, right? The role of financialization and, like the Blackstones and other folks, how they're capitalizing and benefiting. And I think if we get into COVID, I want to talk a little bit about that.
The story you are telling is the story that people are telling almost from every country around the world. There is a name for it, the dark towers. New built towers that stand empty nighttime. You can see there's nobody turning off and on the lights. And that's it's kind of scary and it's as vulgar as Jeff Bezos' yacht. And if he's made all that money, he could, for God's sake, spend something on some decent work, kind of paying his workers or using his money in a way so it could benefit others. And the same goes with people who park their money in apartments and houses and let them stand empty while people are sleeping in the streets.
I thought two things were particularly interesting about what Pete said. First of all, was that when these sales and deals for multi-story developments are done, they get these incredible deals on the land, tax breaks, other incentives to encourage them to come in, all public money, as Pete said. And for me, when I hear public, that for me is opportunity for activism because it is the public actors, our governments, who have human rights responsibilities and have to be accountable to the people. And so I think that is actually the next kind of step with activism around financialization is to go after those incentives that are actually public money. And the other thing I've been thinking about that comes from what Pete said is I think we have to start disrupting the actual sales themselves and figure out how to intervene in those sales so that those sales never happen, actually. That's my latest. And how to do that, I'm not exactly sure. I'm working on that. But that that involves things like ensuring cities have the power to intervene in sales, but of course, like right of first refusal, right? Where a city could bid on something. But that, of course, means that the city needs to actually have the mindset that they should do that and that they should do that for the public good. But anyway, those were my two thoughts. But Pete raised the pandemic.
I mean, this podcast is a baby of the pandemic because we couldn't travel. And one of the first things we did was actually your recommendations to governments regarding the pandemic. And it, of course, it's kind of obvious. Wash your hands. Well, you need a place to wash your hands. You know, it's you need a home. And so you called to the governments of the world that you need to house people now. So, of course, I would like to hear from Pete what happened when the pandemic became real in Los Angeles.
A lot happened on one hand, right? Just in terms of mutual aid, people leaning in. But insofar as duty bearers stepping up to provide during the pandemic, that fell flat, right? And so let's think about it this way. January, March, we know the pandemic is heading to the U.S., and we're very clear in Skid Row that there would be no help coming. We all recall, and it wasn't so long ago, that words like shelter in place, right? Stay at home. Like, what does sheltering in place look like for someone who's living their life in an informal settlement or a tent, right? What does a stay at home order look like, right? To an individual who's living in informal settlements, right? What does washing your hands profusely all day long look like in communities who have been fighting for public health infrastructure for a decade, but still has none? What does masking up look like for poor people when even wealthy folks at the early stages weren't given access to masks? And so we knew early on that there would be no help coming, right? Our center is located in the heart of Skid Row. It's the LA Can Justice and Wellness Center, right? And so as soon as the pandemic hit, I would say like within 3 days after the CDC shelter in place order came out, all of the charitable food giving in our community fell flat, gone immediately, right? Because now all the churches and all of the other do-gooders are, filling their cabinets and bracing for this storm. And we had members showing up at our front gates, right? And let me just say, when I tell the story, we were not trying to be martyrs at all, but we knew if we did not lean in, help would not come, right? And so we started putting together a team of mutual aid packaging. Now, our organization doesn't do blankets and soups and meals and stuff like that. We build power. But because everyone was gone, we had to quickly build the infrastructure, right, to provide stay-at-home kits, right? And what does that look like in our community? We had to secure tents. We had to secure masks, right? Even when the testing started, the city and the county, they forgot about our community. They were like, right? We're not testing them, right? Because in their minds, it was a disposable community, right? And so we had to go out to community health clinics and others and fight hard to bring them in to start testing our folks, right? And so for the first 3 months, it was all the community, right? It was all the community creating the stay-at-home kits. The other thing that we did, because it's like Maya Angelou says. She says there is nothing of note in history that's done by one person or one organization. And so we believe in this power of togetherness and bringing other folks in. 15,000 people are in Skid Row, 13 to 15,000, but this is both housed and houseless and transitional housing, shelter, what have you. For that 15,000 people, there's only roughly 7 bathrooms, right? And so we knew early on that this idea of sanitation was if sanitation was the nexus, or not having your hands washed was the nexus to an outbreak, we knew we were in trouble. And so we looked afar. We looked to see what the Congolese did during the Ebola crisis, right? And they tapped rain barrels. And so we started sourcing, and this is in the height of the pandemic. We created these rain barrels called sanitation stations, where we got community artists and artists from outside of the community to paint these beautiful messages, right? And these healthy messages around hand washing and around COVID-19. We went a step further. We organized attendance in the community. We organized and paid community health promoters to teach folks in all of the informal settlements around Skid Row and citywide on how and why to use these sanitation stations. And so because we weren't getting the mere basics, y'all, we weren't getting the ability to wash our hands. And so this is where the agency and the resilience and drawing down on history and relationships really helped. And I'll be happy to report, interestingly enough, and this, across the country, everyone thought that houseless communities were going to be ravaged by COVID-19. Now, while that might be true in some of the shelters, by and large, folks who were living outside, who were sheltering in place our way, were pretty safe, right, from the pandemic. We're pretty safe. And so our numbers never got out of hand and never got out of control for those folks who were living outside.
I love this idea of looking to the Congo to see how they dealt with Ebola and bringing it back to the streets of LA. I mean, that for me is it's amazing and so clever. But it also speaks to one of my deep concerns, which is, of course, California is the 5th largest economy in the world. And look at what conditions you're facing and the people in Skid Row are facing and what you have to do. I mean, that starkness is what has always just obviously part of what has disturbed me deeply about what's happening on Skid Row. And one question I have, has the election of Biden made any difference? Or is this all happening at local and state level? I mean, the ignoring of Skid Row, the maltreatment, the policing, the criminalization, the ongoing racism, dispossession, colonialism, etc. Does it make a difference to have Joe Biden as president?
Oh, Leilani, now that's not a fair question, because you just jumbled like 50 questions in there, and I'm like, I want to answer all of that. There's so much there. It's so rich. So let me just say, when we do our work, we act locally, but we're thinking globally. We act locally, but we're thinking nationally, right? And so we have a mayor who wanted to be the president, but then figured out, like, that's not going to happen, right? Who is refusing the Project Room Key 100% reimbursable dollars to place folks inside of hotels during the pandemic. You have the Biden administration that's giving a 100% reimbursable subsidy to states, right? Like 100%. You can buy motels, you can buy hotels, right? You can erect structures, right? You can do all of this. And our mayor has said, and this was like 2 weeks ago, because we've been pushing him. And so here's a dirty little secret. This is what we want to do. For us, we're like, let's get as many people inside of these hotels as possible, right? We have these huge, the Marriott and, you name it, all of these hotels that are Skid Row adjacent, right? That are responsible for about $1 billion worth of subsidies in tax forgiveness, right? And so how does this work? We say to they say to hotel operators, if you build in this campus, in this Staples, LA Lives, AEG campus, we will forgive your hotel tax for 25 years. Now, the rub with forgiving the hotel tax for 25 years, the hotel tax is the tax that actually funds the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. That is the only local source of dollars that we have for affordable housing. And you give all of that away, right? You give all of that away for forgiveness because your idea of the city is not for the residents. And so for us, pandemic, or let's say syndemic, hits because it's two pandemics at once. It's COVID-19 and it's poverty, right? Together. It hits, we immediately say, open the doors to the hotels because we own them, right? Like we have a vested interest in them. The mayor, who also owns stake in a hotel, he's like, I'm not opening those doors, right? I'm not opening those doors. But then he goes even further and says last week that he cynically, him, not me, he says, I cynically don't want to place people in hotels because there's no place for them to go after. But instead of hotels, what he doesn't say is he non-cynically is erecting parking lots and painting little white squares and placing tents on those squares temporarily. And so this is the logic, or this is the tales of a few cities that are going on in Los Angeles.
So, I mean, I read some numbers here. So California has 25% of the homeless population in the US. It's much higher numbers than in other states. Why?
If you asked that question 20 years ago, the stock answer would have been, those people just don't try hard enough. Meritocracy, right? If one job isn't enough, they should have worked 2 jobs, 3 jobs, like whatever it takes to pay the rent, they should have done it, right? Or they would have told you it's because, they're alcoholics and it's mental illness, right? We've worked for a long time to actually force the governments to tell the truth. The reality, Frederick, here is, particularly when we look at Black and brown homelessness, deindustrialization. Like these are all political and economic choices. Deindustrialization, right? The moving of all the sort of the industry jobs that were here, steel, auto, aerospace, gone, plummet. Then you have a broken safety net system, right? Not like a non-existent safety net system. Then you have the war on drugs, which is the war on people, which then does something called asset stripping when it nets so many hundreds of thousands of people, right? And then make them ineligible for employment that doesn't exist anyway. And then we get to NAFTA, right? And you just have this whole hodgepodge of why people are here without. The other thing, it's interesting, and that's a great question, Frederick. So here in Los Angeles, at a median, the median wealth for white Angelenos is $350,000, and that's largely linked to housing inflation. That's because they owned homes, right? Now, the juxtaposition for Black folks, it's $3,500. So $350,000 because you have inflated houses. Black folks, $3,500. And then for Latinos, Latinx, it's $4,000. But then let's go.
They're doing fine, the Latinos.
Doing fine, right? Doing $500 better than Black folks. But let's hold on liquid assets. The things that you own that you can sell if everything goes bad. Those same white folks are worth $100,000. Black folks are worth $300. So we only have $300 worth of things that we could actually sell, right, if all went bad. And Latinos, and I don't get this stat, but Latinos have zero, right? And so you think about the pandemic, pre-pandemic, there were 350,000 families at risk of becoming houseless, like barely hanging on because they're working 3 or 4 jobs, right? Or they're living in shitty conditions, right? Paying more money to live in slum conditions. Now, what we are estimating in evictions now in Los Angeles is anywhere from 600,000 to 700,000 families. So we're talking about roughly 1.4 million people, right, who are at risk, at an extreme risk of becoming houseless.
1 million people at risk. I was thinking, of course, I've done another film in Los Angeles called Bike versus Cars, where I looked into the history of all the highways. And I know that like 80% of all land in the Los Angeles area goes to park cars, basically, or to host cars, meaning that a lot of homes got lost when you built all the highways. So I think that might also play a role in this game. How do you see that?
That definitely plays a role in this game. And that's not just a Los Angeles story. That's a Florida story, right? That's Overtown, right? They give you this promise. They give you this promise of direct routes, right? Like, we're going to build a highway through your neighborhood so it can take you to the promised land, right? And it's ironic. This is a great question, Frederick. So here in Los Angeles, there is a takeover, a housing takeover movement, right? Because unbeknownst to many people, here in Los Angeles, our Metropolitan Transit Authority, the folks who are responsible for the freeways and the buses, when they were planning on building these freeways, some of the freeways did not get built. And so the houses were never raised. And so we have beautiful single family homes by the hundreds that sit empty next to the freeway, sit empty, right? And so people are now taking over those properties that were linked to that freeway construction and being met with just force, right? Met with force. And so yeah, the role of transportation in the displacement and the banishment of communities is a long story, but has deep roots in this country.
And then Jeff Bezos' friends in Beverly Hills, they managed to protect their neighborhood from the highways. So it never happened. So it's interesting, yeah.
Not only did the Transportation Authority knock down homes and build roads through communities to sort of get rid of folks, they also, in our busing system, right, in our public transportation, they made it as difficult as possible for poor people to use public transportation to get to areas like Beverly Hills, to the beaches, right, to the public spaces. So made it almost impossible to do this using public transportation. So not only did they raise your community and knock it down and move you out, but then they made it almost impossible for you to be able to enjoy the natural resources like the beach in California. So,
Pete, we couldn't get through the podcast without discussing the lawsuit and recent judgment against the city of LA. The case was launched by a group of businesses called the LA Alliance, and as I understand it, the Alliance wants to see Skid Row cleaned up. Some have hailed Judge Carter's decision in the case historic, but my question to you is, from your perspective, is it a good decision? Will it actually ensure the right to housing for Skid Row residents consistent with human rights?
It is not a human rights judgment. The LA Alliance for Human Rights is not a human rights organization. It is the business community. The judge gives you this 110-page dissertation on race, right? On structural racism. But the remedy that he establishes does not match the rhetoric, right? So he talks a lot about the things I talked about earlier, redlining and, home ownership and all these things. But then in the end, he says things like, if you reduce houselessness by 60% in a given district. And so in our country, in the city of Los Angeles, we have 15 districts that have 15 council members. And so instead of looking at the city as a whole, if you reduce 60% of the houseless people in your district, you can then go forth with criminalization. I've never thought that you had to get a little bit over half the problem before you can start doing something else, right? So at 60%, and you're right, Leilani, his order is not for housing, right? His order is for an offer of temporary shelter. So, you know how it looks. And so everything that precedes the actual thing that he's saying sounds as if he's saying to people, I am a housing advocate. Like, I am looking for permanent housing. But in the end, what he's calling for is any type of situation, whether that's a parking lot shelter, a pallet home, which he's really fond of. It's these 6-month structures. If you offer that to someone and they need to take it, and it's 60%, after 60% is taken care of, you can create enforcement zones and this, that, and the other. Now, the other thing about the case, and this is what's great for this conversation, right? So the lead plaintiff in the case is a dude named Larry Rausch. Larry Rausch is one of the largest property owners in downtown Los Angeles. He's the lead plaintiff. There was just a story that was released last week by the LA Times that shows Larry Rausch has just filed for permits for a $1.5 billion to $2 billion campus, like towers and promenades in Skid Row, but calls Skid Row the arts district. This is the lead plaintiff. And so now it becomes really clear what the lawsuit is really about.
You are sitting on valuable land. People want your land, and there's a lot of money of it, and you are sitting there, but then you provide some arts, and then so they want to use your work, your creativity, the beauty that you have created on Skid Row. They want to sell it as an asset for investors. How did you land there? Why are you working with putting so much soul into Skid Row?
I was looking for my cousin. And it was days. It was before we had apps, right? And there was a book called The Thomas Guide. And someone said, I saw your cousin on 5th and Crocker, right? And I go to 5th and Crocker, and there's this beautiful mural that's been there 40, 50 years called the Berlin Wall. And on this mural, you have, Sojourner Truth. You have Che Guevara, right? You have Harriet Tubman. You have all of these images of these leaders in our communities peering down on poverty. And so when I landed on that community, on that corner, I didn't find my cousin, I found myself, right? Because I looked around and was like, how are all of these folks who look like me, who are living in the shadow of all of these wealthy multinational corporations, getting nothing? And so that was the spark that sort of struck the idea that led to the building of the Los Angeles Community Action Network, because I felt like we were never this was not a problem of how many sandwiches you could give. This was not a problem of how many shelter beds. This was a problem of inequity and wealth and structural racism. And that's how I attacked it. And, we attacked it with building power. We've attacked it with culture. We've attacked it with art, Frederick, because we believe that art has no address, right? We believe that our streets can be the amphitheaters. We believe that our walls can be the canvas that inspires folks to want to resist, as my shirt says, that no one can see but us, resist and create a new North Star.
Did you find your cousin?
I did find my cousin. A real sad note, but happy note. He actually was shot on Skid Row, leaving a substance abuse program. He was shot in his back. He lay dying on the ground, but someone in Skid Row, a woman who had some medical experience, was a nurse. She stabilized him and gave him CPR, right? There were dudes in the neighborhood, guys in the neighborhood, that ran the shooter down and held them down. This is unheard of. This doesn't happen in big cities, right? And so this community gave me my cousin back, right? This community made sure that my cousin both lived, stayed around, organized, built power in the community for about 7 years. And now he moved to Atlanta with his family, and he's doing well.
Oh, what a beautiful end of this podcast. I mean, now we can go out and, well, let's have a beer at least. So Pete White, Executive Director of the LA Community Action Network. And I guess there is a webpage. We will put a link up on the blurb of this show so you can find out more, because inspiration, I think we all need to inspire each other. And I mean, you for sure inspire a lot of people around the US, but I mean, you also, I know we have a lot of homeless advocates around the world. I mean, some of them have been also writing to us before this. There's somebody, Guy Leon up in British Columbia somewhere writing to us. And I actually got a mail from a journalist in Northern California that lost her house during the pandemic, and she's now living in her car, but she still works. So she wants to review the film and push the film. You've seen it. And we should come back to LA and organize a screening at the street corner in Skid Row. Can't we do that?
Come on, we can do it at LA Can. Are you kidding me? I was waiting. Yeah. We have this series called Conversations and Tasters.
Let's do it.
Where we can bring 300 people. Let's go.
Let's go. Let's do that as soon as this shit is over. Yeah. So
that's right.
Let's do it. Thank you very much, Pete. Leilani, you have to say something about how we fund this show.
Yeah, we have no money for this show. And so we are reliant on our ever-growing Patreons. I think we have more Patreons now than ever.
We have 50 Patreons, and they are like bringing in almost $250 a month. Anyway, Thank you very much, and see you soon, and see you in LA, Pete.
Thank you guys for having me. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thanks.
Thanks so much, Pete.
Pushback Talks is produced by WG Film. To watch Push, visit pushthefilm.com. You can also support us by becoming a Patreon at patreon.com/pushbacktalks. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you again next week.